I jerked awake to a barely audible knock at the front door and stared into the darkness. It was one of those starless winter nights when the darkness becomes thick and palpable, enveloping the still sleep-bound mind, preventing it from thinking logically. No one in his right mind would get up from under a warm blanket into the arms of the apartment, which had cooled down during the night, to find out who brought him to the doorstep at the third hour of the night. But I got up for some reason. Slowly my fingers moved along the wall in search of the light switch, but I didn't find it, though it seemed that everything in this small room had been memorized long ago. So I walked to the front door in the dark and listened at first. For a minute or so there was complete silence, and not a single sound came from the entryway. I thought I was just dreaming about the knocking, but suddenly there were two strong, insistent blows, making me shudder in surprise. It was already a form of insolence, fear replaced by anger, and I turned the key sharply and jerked the door open. The landing was empty. There was no echo from upstairs or downstairs of the Joker's footsteps, who had decided to amuse himself in such a strange way. I didn't think much of it at the time because I lived on the second floor, and someone could have jumped out while I was opening the lock, although he would have had to be very quick to do so. I shivered as the cold rushed into the apartment, locked the apartment as quickly as possible, and finally turned on the light in the hallway. The simplified layout of my one-room dwelling was more than anything else conducive to strong drafts, so the kitchen, separated from the room by a thin wall, was usually closed tightly with a door with a strong Soviet-style latch. Apparently, I had forgotten to do that yesterday, because the door was slightly ajar. The adrenaline had already subsided, my brain was slowly falling asleep, so my hands automatically closed the bolt, and my obedient legs carried my sleepy body back to bed. The night, broken by the snowfall, continued to pull the light out of everything, and I fell instantly into a dreamless sleep. It had been an hour, or maybe only 5 minutes, since I'd laid down, and something disturbed my hearing again. It was pitch black, so I sat up and listened. A second, another, and suddenly there was a familiar knock, but no longer on the front door, but on the wall from the kitchen to the room. It was almost palpable in the silence of the night. An icy wave ran through my body from head to toe. The knocking became stronger, more frequent, and slowly but evenly progressed along the wall toward the hallway. I was clearly aware that I had closed the front door and that I was a very light sleeper, so no one could enter the apartment without waking me up, but the insistent knocking was real. Knock, 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 closer and closer to the kitchen exit. Knock, 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 knock. My heart echoed, ready to burst out of my chest. My mind tried to find a combination of logical actions for such a situation, but the illogic of what was happening turned the flow of thoughts inside out. I remembered everything I had heard about ghosts, house builders, and other nocturnal visitors, and found nothing better than the old way my great-grandmother had told me about when she let me into her village house for the night. She repeated every time, "Grandson, if you hear a fuss in the hay or a loud clinking of dishes in the middle of the night, you can shout at the noise with the last words that you and the boys shout while you are running in the field, but louder, for that I will not fight your ears." I couldn't think of the last words, so I just breathed deep and, frightened of my own hoarse voice, shouted, "Go to hell!" The knocking was silent for a moment, then a shrill, falsetto laugh came from behind the wall, and the tapping, much stronger and faster, went to the door to the hallway. I jumped out of bed in horror and ran out of the room on woozy legs in 2 leaps. The latch was still securely closed. As I frantically jumped into my clothes, not caring about neatness, a tapping sound reached the door. We both fell silent. I could hear the deep breathing coming from the other side. The silent scene went on for a few minutes, and then the door shook with a tremendous bang. Pieces of old plaster flew from the ceiling. The hinges rattled, but the thick latch held. Another blow followed, and then another, but it struck the window. The glass rattled, and the window frame opened. I, finally losing my senses, jumped out of the apartment and ran into the darkness of the empty streets, hearing instead of the echo of my heavy footsteps only the chilling knock, 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 lost in the howl of the cold wind. I spent the rest of the night wandering around the neighborhood mindlessly, warming myself in the entryways and ducking every shadow. I couldn't stay in one place for long. My subconscious, as if mocking me, picked up any small sounds and transformed them into echoes of tapping, driving me away again and again. Soon the late December dawn broke, followed by sleepy dog walkers with their unseasonably cheerful pets. People began to flock to parking lots and bus stops, and the city came alive. All this ordinary, gray bustle brought me back to a sense of reality, and my nighttime fears receded. All that remained was the residue of my own stupid cowardice and a strong desire to sleep. In spite of that, I didn't want to go back at all. The irrational fear of the night before was still there, but my common sense told me that my home was my goddamn fortress. I had to make an attempt to prove it, first and foremost to myself. Slowly, stretching every second of the journey into something disproportionately long, I made my way back. The drive was only a couple blocks long and took almost an hour. As I got closer to the house, my anxiety grew more and more, so, for reassurance, I invited a friend who lived nearby to join me, under the pretense of helping me prepare for an allegedly upcoming renovation. Emboldened by his quick agreement, I stepped into the entryway, and a few moments later I was standing in front of my front door, listening for sounds. It was quiet inside. Not without alarm, I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, quickly turning on the lights. Everything looked exactly as it had when I'd fled. From the hallway, I could see the unmade bed in the room, some things scattered on the floor that I dropped in my haste to pack. The kitchen remained locked. I took a deep breath and slowly pulled the latch back, trying to be quiet, and then, with a fist of will, I swung the door open. Everything inside was in place. I stepped boldly inside, looking around, checking the door from the inside, the window frame, and the floor. There was no sign of anyone's nighttime presence anywhere. Then the wall separating the kitchen from the room caught my attention. Stepping away from the window, I tapped lightly on it, trying to replicate the sound I had heard during the night. Tapping, I began to slowly make my way toward the door. Knock, 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 knock. Go to hell. A loud scream suddenly came from the room. I was dazed. It was my own voice, only with some completely unnatural squeal. I stood there for a few moments, unable to move out of fear, and then I lunged for the exit, slamming my shoulder into the kitchen door. Old plaster shattered, but the door wouldn't budge. The latch was locked on the other side. I stood there, staring blankly ahead, breathing heavily as I tried to comprehend what was happening. The cell phone that had been left on the shelf in the hallway rang. For a couple of seconds, the ringtone loudly announced an incoming call, and then it cut off. My voice on the other side of the door was quietly canceling a meeting with a friend who, as far as I could make out, was calling to warn me that he was running a little late but would be here any minute. That was the last straw. I jumped on the windowsill and opened the kitchen window, terrified, and I had to get out of here any way I could. The snowdrift had drifted downstairs for the past month, and the second floor wasn't exactly high off the ground, so I jumped forward without a second's hesitation, but caught the edge of the window handle with the pocket of my unbuttoned jacket. The frame with the glass closed with a resounding slam. A sharp jerk slightly changed the trajectory of my fall, and I hit very painfully, landing far from the center of the snowdrift in which I was aiming. Groaning and holding my side, I struggled to my feet and suddenly found that this oversight had probably saved my life. In the center of the snowdrift, lightly covered with yesterday's snow, was a sharp piece of rusty iron pipe, which, if it hadn't been for chance, would have easily pierced me through. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but at that moment my panicked mind immediately linked the events in the apartment and that piece of pipe into a single fatal chain. Someone's malicious intent was trying to lead me across the thin bridge between thousands of probabilities straight to death. That's what I thought at the time. It was this fact of realizing the alien interference that gave me strength, generating a kind of noble anger. I didn't run away in a panic, I thought. Back in my driveway and sitting by my own door, I pondered. For a long, long time, putting everything that had happened on the illusory shelves of sanity. The day turned to evening, and not a sound came from the apartment. The cold and drowsiness were closing in on me, and I couldn't think of any good ideas. It had been an hour since I'd last gotten to my feet, strolling down the landing. Sleep was killing me, and only the bone-chilling frost through the loose windows of the entryway was somehow invigorating. Finally, I realized that I had no more strength left. I was broken, hungry, terribly cold, and about to fall asleep on the floor. All of these things pushed the fear to the back of my mind. The keys to the apartment were still inside, so I couldn't think of anything more idiotic than just knocking on my own apartment, slumped against the wall beside me in exhaustion. It didn't take more than a minute before the door suddenly opened softly. Vaguely aware of my actions, I grabbed the handle, yanking it sharply toward me, slid into the apartment and slammed the door shut, locking the lock from the inside. My legs shook with terror, and I sat in the pitch darkness of the corridor, breathing heavily and waiting for my fate. Suddenly, there were two heavy thumps and a frustrated, shrill sigh from the stairwell. Then there was a ringing silence. I, faintly believing in everything that was happening, gradually realized that everything was over, that I had managed to win the strange, infernal game by accident, and then I heard a faint knock at the door of the neighbors across the hall. 3 short ones. 3 long ones. 3 short ones. Someone is scratching at my room door with a piece of wood. A steady, unhurried scratch, time after time, although, given what I saw in the restaurant downstairs, scratching is most likely a claw. Yeah, well, this thing has all the time in the world. And plenty of food, considering the screaming from the neighboring rooms stopped a long time ago. What have I got? A couple bottles of mineral water, a bottle of champagne, and some beer. It's not much, but it's all that's left in the minibar. I drink the beer in one big gulp. I light the penultimate cigarette. Funny enough, that's exactly how my deceased brother used to scratch on the door when I locked him in the pantry. Yes, I realize now that I shouldn't have done that, but I was 16 then, and I wanted to spend time with my friends. I didn't need to take care of a kid with autism on my shoulders on a handout from my mother who worked around the clock. There was a howl outside the door, and the scratching stopped. The shriek, continuing on a single, insanely high note that made the glass rattle, receded down the corridor. Looks like she's going to finish her meal. I carefully put out the half-decayed cigarette on the back of the leather sofa and put it next to the ashtray. It leaves a foul-smelling stench on the sofa. Yeah, they saved money here, too. I think the fact that I smoke is the only thing holding her back. The creature yelled in the next room, as if agreeing with my thoughts. There was the sound of tearing flesh, a ghoulish growl, chomping, bones crunching. Soundproofing's no good in here. I think my friend's having lunch. I should stop by and say bon appetit. We've been through so much together. He was the one who reassured me when my brother, having found matches in the pantry, decided to have a good game. He was the one we lived with our grief-stricken mother for the first time after the house burned down with my baby brother. I take a step toward the door. Next. Whoa, whoa, whoa. After the fire, we moved in with my father, who agreed to take us in despite disagreements with my mother. There was no friend. Step back. The creature howled louder, practically going ultrasonic. These are not my thoughts. I rush over to the dent I'd left in the couch, grabbing a cigarette and a lighter with shaky hands. I pressed the wheel down hard, knocking out the spark. I sucked in a lungful of bitter, but now so life-saving smoke, and exhaled toward the door, as if trying to shield myself from what awaited me behind it. I was smoking near the first-floor entrance to the restaurant when there was shouting from inside. Forgetting the cigarette smoldering in my teeth, I slammed my shoulder into the door, only to see customers smiling happily as they walked toward a screaming, bloody something tearing pieces off the body that had been a pretty girl bartender half a minute ago. The creature stared unblinking into my eyes. It was waiting. Yeah, I didn't shit my pants then and rushed to my room, childishly thinking that no one would get me there. It was foolish to think so. The filter of the cigarette stinks and burns my fingers. I shake my head, extinguish the flame, and flick it toward the door. There's a knock on it. 3 short ones. 3 long ones. 3 short ones. Anybody there? I heard you in there. Open up, please. A squeaky voice. The knocking repeats, becoming more intense with each knock. Please, it's around here somewhere. I'm really scared. The brother, choking back his cries, bangs on the door. It smells like burnt meat. A child is drumming on the door about 2 meters high. Alas, I don't want to open the door. I'm sorry, darling, but my brother burned down 15 years ago. I flick my lighter, about to light another one. It makes a pitiful squeak. The wheel spins. There's no friction, no spark. The brother keeps knocking on the door. Uncle. A womb-like growl instead of a cry completes his sentence. The creature's banging on the door. I frantically rummage through my pockets for a spare lighter. Chest, back, sides. Nowhere to be found. Mom's knocking on the door. We have to open it. 3 short ones. 3 long ones. 3 short ones. Son, have you been smoking again? Where's your brother? Did you lock him up again? Open the door immediately. Yes, Mom. I put my head down obediently and go to open the door. Mom's waiting. I wake up in my bed. The blanket clings to my wet body. The room is dark. I exhale with a sigh of relief. A dream, just a dream. The door of my room is quietly scratched open by someone. 3 short ones. 3 long ones. 3 short ones. Smells like garbage.